Please be seated. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ian Jandrell. I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor at this university, and I have the privilege of working very, very closely now and again with the Faculty of Health Sciences. My portfolio also involves systems and operations, so I suspect that one of the other reasons they make me do this is that in the unlikely event of load shedding, it will be me who has to fix it. But if we do have load shedding, just hang on to somebody close to you and wait until the lights come back on. But good evening. Folk, it's a real pleasure to greet all of you here in the Senate Room in Solomon Mshlangu House at Wits University, as well as to welcome all of our online guests who are joining us from all over the world. It really is so important to be able to engage with an inaugurating professor who's going to show us how they manage load shedding, lights failing, ICD challenges, and all of that to show how good they are as a professor. And that's the fun of being an inaugurating professor. My job is also to introduce you to the procession, and I welcome, of course, the Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences, Professor Shabir Mahdi, Professor Lucille Bloomberg, who you'll be introduced to later, who's going to propose the vote of thanks, and of course, our inaugurating professor, Professor Francois Venter. It's also very important to recognize that for the inaugurating professor, it's an opportunity to stand up in front of family, loved ones, peers, and colleagues to share their expertise and to share the journey that they've been on. It is indeed a wonderful, wonderful opportunity for all of us. I also want to just conclude by saying one other very important thing. I'm a fairly formal person. You'll see that I'm wearing running shoes. This is not because I'm running. It's because I've done something terrible to my ankle. I'm now undergoing a medical experiment, and that's why I'm walking like this. So please forgive me for that. I feel quite bad doing this. But nevertheless, in my heart, this is a wonderful, wonderful occasion. I welcome you all, and I hope that we have a wonderful evening together. I'd now like to call upon the Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences, Professor Shabir Mahdi, to introduce our inaugurating professor. Shabir.
Thank you, Prof. General, and good evening, colleagues, friends, and family of Francois Venter, Professor Francois Venter. So before starting, I think for all of us that are actually in the healthcare fraternity, we probably heard the announcement of the sad news this morning on the passing of Prof. Jerry Kuvadia. I was fortunate enough to meet Prof. Jerry Kuvadia in the late 1980s as part of some political school, and over time truly admired his contribution as a freedom fighter, as a social as well as political activist, as a clinician, as a scientist, as a trainer, and someone that was never afraid to speak truth to power. So I ask for you just to observe a brief moment of silence before I introduce Prof. Venter. Okay, thank you. So coincidentally, Prof. Venter's inaugural lecture is coming on the day of the passing of Prof. Jerry Kuvadia, and to some extent, analogies can be drawn. I've got the biosketch, which I'll read out, but beyond the biosketch, I think most of us know Francois in terms of the type of person he is, the science that he's undertaken, but more importantly, is the role that he's played, again, in a space of advocacy around social issues, around political issues, around issues of human rights. And it's sort of the example of a scientist that takes it to the level where it should be, in that we do not operate in the silos of our laboratories and our clinics, but we rather use our work to actually inform government on policies, but at the same time, when we see things not happening the manner in which they should be happening, we take a stand and actually make our voice heard. And Francois Venter certainly ticks those boxes. So Francois Venter is currently the head of Essentia at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, where he received all of his training, undergraduate, postgraduate, PhD, as well as his ongoing research career. His work involves health systems research that directly translate into national programs, and most recently involved the investigation of a number of newer antiretrovirals. He leads multiple antiretroviral treatment optimization studies and is currently working on a new access program through the private pharmacies within South Africa, as well as patient linkage to care intervention and new models of primary care for chronic diseases. He has led large PEPFAR-funded HIV programs in South Africa, focusing on men, women and children, young people, truckers, sex workers, and the LGBTQ communities. For over 20 years, he has been an advisor to bodies such as the South African government, UNAIDS, and WHO, contributing to international, regional, and national HIV guidelines. He recently served as a member of the Ministerial Advisory Committee for COVID-19. The less about that, the better. And he has been an active interest in medical ethics and has been involved in several HIV-related human rights cases within the Southern African region. He supervises a large number of master's and PhD projects, and recently his work has included publication in leading journals, including the New England Journal of Medicine, The Lancet, Nature, and AIDS. So clearly an extremely accomplished person and someone that's active at multiple levels. So Professor, welcome.
Thanks, everybody. And yeah, thanks for the invitation. These are my various disclosures. Notice the Wits, Shabir, you insisted. And just to acknowledge the people who actually do all the work in my unit, who many of whom are here today. So it is quite a curious juxtaposition of one disease that makes you skinny and, obviously the one that doesn't. And I managed to dodge this lecture for years by pretending that I didn't see the Wits emails, that they weren't working, all the usual excuses. And then COVID came along, and I realized I'd made a terrible mistake because I could have done this online without all the pomp and ceremony. But anyway, what you're supposed to do here is you're supposed to come here and talk and where you came from and the people who helped you along and your career trajectory and brag all about your research and everything. I'm going to do all those things. But you're also supposed to profess to the lay public. So I'm not going to be talking to you about arcane theories about integrase inhibitors, and sorry, Jeremy, in terms of how weight gets gained, mainly because I don't really understand them. But the VC for research sat me down on Friday night and said I wasn't taking this nearly seriously enough. This is supposed to be the pinnacle of my career. And I was like, okay, that's good. Unfortunately for the VC of research is that we've known each other for a very, very long time. And that, in fact, as I was going through my research files, I realized we published our first paper together 20 years ago on some obscure research mutation when we were going to the Violent Femmes concert over there. And going to the local IAS conference in Thailand. So I'm going to do all these things and hopefully go through it very, very quickly. I do need to acknowledge my research mentor, which is Professor Charles Feldman, who's a complete sucker for punishment. He took me through my master's, for which I think is the record at the medical school for the longest master's ever done. I think it took 10 years for me to actually submit it. And Charles is an amazing human being. He was co-supervision advisor with Professor Barry Jaffe, an endocrinologist, and kept pushing me to do a PhD, for which I have no idea why he thought he should do that. I should actually actively hide from him walking around Johannesburg Hospital to the then Johannesburg Hospital because I thought he'd ask me again where was my master's project. So then I designed my PhD project with Professor Clayton Jones, also one of the most published human beings on the planet. So between him and Charles, they were my two co-supervisors on my PhD. I walked into my assessors committee with the two of them on either side. I felt like a mafia don walking with the two biggest sort of protectors in the world next to each other to the assessors committee. And Wits being Wits, it was packed with basic scientists. And they sent me home to go and rewrite my entire protocol. So that was my starting point. But both of these human beings are amazing. They were incredibly generous. And as I said, I have no idea why they put up with me during this period of time. The other very important coaches in my life are my tennis coach and my rock climbing coach, both of which are very, very important, and both of which are also dealing with very low-quality human beings when it comes to their various sports. I'm very enthusiastic about both, just not terribly good at them. And my tennis coach very famously had this quote when I probably missed one of the easiest volleys. When I say missed, as in like missed it completely, the easiest volley in the history of tennis. And she had this to say about me, and I think this probably applies to my research career as well. So there's some things the best coach in the world can't fix. So, well. I was also coming up with various titles for my talk, and this title I was told was offensive to both endocrinologists and the HIV community, but I honestly did think it probably does hold for what's happened in the history of HIV. And part of my master's was putting me, what I thought at the time, off endocrinology for the rest of time, because it was on adrenal glands, which are honestly is another story altogether. The second title that came up was this one, Pretty Fly for a White Guy. Now, this comes from having had probably the best 50th birthday in the history of the world, arranged to go by Elizabeth Wallace, who's in the audience, who managed to manufacture me to go and discuss ARV or HIV transmission patterns with Dexter Holland, who's the lead singer for The Offspring, just before he gave a concert out in Italy. So before we went out drinking tequila together with the dead Kennedy. So this, honestly, was where I actually invited him to come and watch the lecture. So he'd just been given his PhD by Alabama University in HIV. So I didn't go with that title. I went with the obesity and HIV one. When I was coming, my unit staged an intervention about what I was going to wear. Now, I gave a plenary in the TB Suspects T-shirt about 2 months ago, and my entire senior staff sat me down last week, and as one said, "You're not wearing the TB Suspects T-shirt for your plenary." One of our donors, thank you very much, Shirley, suggested this T-shirt, which I think is one that our researchers should, the Find Out T-shirt, which I think is a very good one. And Sumisa said, "Why don't you wear your Mandela T-shirt?" So anyway, this is not my unit, which if this research thing goes south, we are probably quite well situated to become a fashion house, I think. If you ever come to our unit, you'll see people are dressed very, very well. If we do go to becoming a fashion house, I probably am going to have to be retired. But people do dress very, very well, including Anton Posnak, who's Dr. HIV UK up on the top there. All the famous HIV clinicians are now wearing this clothing brand, which is called Henri Style T-shirt. You can go online and buy your T-shirts. But yes, we dress very well. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be discussing a whole range of research, and I'm very sorry because there's lots of it, so I can only really focus in on the obesity and some of this dolutegravir work that we've done. But there's tons there, and while I was paging through Wendy and Maria, I was just looking at something there that we did on integrated research in 2010, resistance, and we should probably go and revisit that paper because it's suddenly all the vogue. It's also a pity because I don't get to tease all the people I have worked with over the years who are absolutely amazing, but much younger than in some of these photos. But back to HIV and obesity, which is what we're here to talk about. And I'm first going to spend some time on obesity, but the interesting thing about obesity and the field of obesity and treatments is it feels like HIV in the era of 2000. It's like some whole lot of stuff happening, it's exciting, but it's a lot to be learned. But I'm supposed to tell you about how I got here, and the first thing is about WITS, and I'm very proud of my university, especially of some of our deans. I mean, it's practically Shabir, you can see here. But this is the dean in 1949, and like this is like how a dean's supposed to look in my view, you know, like unashamed cigarette, like in front of his microscope, bow tie. This is proper deanery, like out there. I grew up in Palabora, which is this dippy, sleepy, charmless little town in the middle of nowhere, out in the lowfield. Some people love it for some reason. Known for its, I don't know what, mainly big hole copper mine. It's even got a color named after it, appropriately called Palabora dust. Anyway, my parents got married in those days, Afrikaner English. It's a bit like, I was going to say interracial, but that's not right. And I was going to say Muslim Catholic because Muhammad's in it, but that's also not right. It's probably DAEFF marriage now. But anyway, they had a very big family. There was no television in the locals then. And then my family have this thing where they all lie around in a circle, all my brothers and sisters, and there are thousands of them, and we do this every couple of years. So I kind of dropped off in Joburg, and immediately got thrust into student politics, and I feel very sorry for some of these people. There's Billy Ramagopa, who's still the dear colleague at the university, people like Snakes Nyoka, and Michael Avedon and a whole range of people there that were there about to teach this silly little white boy who knew absolutely nothing in 1988 and got thrust at some of the most brutal apartheid politics. But the interesting thing is I learned a lot during that period, including about organizational stuff, which prepared me really well for the wars that were to come for AIDS and then for COVID-19 many, many years later. I also got dropped off. I sat down at the medical school. I knew absolutely no one. All these like high-level St. John's and Rodin's and King David kids who knew everybody. And I was like from the Lowveld and knew absolutely no one. And these three amazing women sat next to me and have sat next to me since time began, ever since. On the left is Anne, my friend who kicks my ass at tennis twice a week and then goes off and is the safety rep for one of the blockbuster oncology drugs. There's Angela, who stayed with me during my house job and during my training time, runs this huge diabetic clinic in Alberton and who is now working in the obesity stuff. And then Lauren, who's an anaesthetist in the UK and who travels the world cycling and going to exciting places. I'm also proud of my university because they did lots of stuff that other universities maybe didn't do enough of. They took a whole of, these are two of my colleagues who during my registrar time were trained up Rwandan colleagues who came to South Africa just after the genocide. Both of them had their families completely wiped out, trained up and went back and started dialysis and ICU units back in Rwanda, started to create. The university's also gone out of its way to increase the number of doctors it's trained. And I think that's something that does need to be acknowledged about FITS, is that it has tried to do it, but with ever less resources from government. It's try to do more and more with less. So let's talk about HIV. Well, this little interaction happened last month. Is an endocrinologist, granted a Cape Town endocrinologist, said this to one of my friends in the MSF, is that treating diabetes is hard, treating HIV is easy. Now, actually, that's true now. In HIV in 2023, you diagnose them once, you start the treatment on the same day with a tablet that has got almost no side effects and it's dirt cheap. It's amazing. It really is amazing. But that endocrinologist, after I wanted to rip his throat out, he's understanding in 2003, it was much harder to treat HIV than it was to treat diabetes. You had to do multiple blood tests to confirm HIV. Then you had to stage them with CD4 counts, tests that came back days, sometimes weeks later. Then you had to give handfuls of tablets in the morning, handfuls of tablets at night. You had to adjust for weight. You had to adjust for whether they wanted kids. You had to add other tablets according to the CD4 count and then take them away again. So this nonsense that somehow HIV was always this easy to treat, it's taken really hard work for us to get there. The one thing about HIV that's interesting is we all were there at the, well, some of us not so much when I look at the audience, but most of us were there from the very beginning, which I remember when Princess Di was shaking hands with HIV positive people without gloves, and what a big deal that was in 1987. And yeah, I mean, I see some people nodding in the audience. I remember vividly, I was still at school. I was just leaving school and thinking, geez, like, that was quite a big deal. And you think about where we've come to. So I came back from the UK after doing a year of training and trained with this man, a hematologist called David Britton, who was a registrar then training with me in the oncology unit. And between 1997 and 2000, David was working in the hematology clinic. He was working with hemophiliacs. And hemophiliacs were entitled to antiretrovirals. In the bizarre reasoning that goes on in the apartheid government's brain, they infected these people with infected blood, therefore they were culpable, therefore they needed ARVs. Nobody else could get ARVs. And David was able to demonstrate to me how powerful these drugs were, even these early drugs, very toxic, multiple tablets. And I was able to learn from him very quickly about what we could do with these. Then I went to Ian Zander's HR. I finished my specialty time and moved to his unit and worked with this. I see a couple of them in the audience. You barely aged. And Ian and his unit taught me about how to do clinical trials, about how to play with these drugs. And it was really the first time I was able to start seeing myself as somebody who was going to get involved in HIV. Then I moved to Helen Reese's WRHI. And sorry, I thought I'd switch this off. This really was really alarmingly, it's going to be Standard Bank. Wondering. That's really very odd. Actually, Anyway, and that meant entry into Hillbrow. We had our offices. I was working at Esalen Street Clinic with a whole range of people. And then this huge insertion of money from, sorry. I did actually switch this off. Anyway, it's probably going to ring about 9 times now. And during this period of time, the American money to start doing stuff, to start escalating, started to enter into the system. We didn't have ARVs immediately at the time, but we did start having access to resources to start preparing for them. And we were one of the few sites that actually had some sort of experience with them. Also at this time, I started engaging with the activists in about 2000, 2001. And I think Sharon actually was the first person to engage with me to say, we've got sick people, we've got drugs, they were essentially smuggling them into the country at the time. Can you help us at the Johannesburg hospital? And I started to learn and work with these people. And I think one thing that really struck me that was so horrifying was they were working in these organizations where people were literally dying around them all the time for lack of access to a drug, while the government was saying, we don't care. This disease doesn't even exist. And I'll talk about it in just a moment, but these incredibly brave people that went through various generations and literally having to say, phoning me up and saying, can you help? Is there anything you can do? And we're completely understanding when I'd say, no, there isn't. This person's going to die. And it was just absolutely horrifying and heartrending. And at the time, we were starting to publish. We were starting to say, as the drugs started to arrive, as all these backroom deals were happening and these weird politics were happening, we started to publish about the first outcomes on the study, showing that patients did really, really well, surprisingly well, even though they were coming in very, very late. It was also the time I started getting involved with the HIV Clinicians Society. And I just wanted to pause there because I think sometimes we laugh about the mantus and the funny things with the garlic and the beetroot and stuff. But there were very, very brave individual clinicians over those periods alongside the activists. But things were absolutely ghastly. And that period between about 93 and 96, when I went away for a year and I came back, there were lots of people with HIV and AIDS dying. But when I came back in 96, 97, it became absolutely catastrophic. And it was mainly focused on the medical wards. I think the surgeons and many of the other areas of medicine were actually relatively protected. But coming back, people were dying on the floors. And it wasn't just 1 or 2, it was 10, 20 every single night at Johannesburg Hospital. At the other hospitals I was working at that stage, we weren't rotating through Barrow, so I didn't have experience there. But at Hillbrow, at Helen Joseph, people were moved around the wards as quickly as possible to free up beds. But it was absolutely horrifying having these 23-year-olds, 27-year-olds just dying one after the other. And I think back at that time and about like the harm it did to the medical psyche, not just of the families and the people around them, but just how many people died and nobody had a plan. It was just the sheer wave of mortality and death and suffering that came during that time. And just the way there's still people coming up now who are saying it never happened. There's Mbeki still standing up and saying it wasn't much of a problem. You still have these people saying, oh, it was a learning thing. And it was just severe in terms of what had happened. And all of those of us who lived through that period, I look back and I don't know how we survived it. Just the sheer intensity and horror of it all. And I think it is something that we do need to reflect on. And at that time as well, even though we suddenly got the ARVs, there was this fight with Mantu, with Mbeki. It went on for 5 years, before Zuma came along, that every single thing we did, we had to fight and fight and fight. We had to fight because there were delays. They wouldn't start ARVs quickly. People had to spend months, even though they had no CD4 counts. We had to fight to get the prisoners on therapy. We had to fight to get foreigners onto therapy. They wouldn't allow Zimbabweans to get treated. We had to fight at every single turn. It just went on and on. There was not enough money for stuff. I remember this battle around just getting people in Hillbrow to treat foreigners, and we did win that battle. It was one of the few ones that we actually did. We actually had to fight this battle in Botswana. That's me meeting with the president of Botswana in the mid-80s, in the mid-2000s, trying to convince them that they actually do need to treat people who are not Botswanan. And that was one of the things that we won. I think the one group of people I'm really proud to have been associated with in my capacity in the Clinician Society were the rural health workers. They were the one group of people who were out there fighting for their patients. And I'm not going to name them all, but many of them lost their jobs actually for doing the right thing and for standing up against government and for doing the right thing and for going out there. They also did really innovative stuff. They were the first people to start getting nurses to start prescribing therapy, to start getting stuff out into the clinics. You know, for a long time, we were only giving ARVs in the hospitals. I did want to pause here for a moment and just maybe make it a bit uncomfortable and say the one group of people who weren't anywhere to be seen are, other than the rural doctors, with other healthcare worker organizations. They're the lawyers, the civil society people, the journalists, everybody else were fighting tooth and nail for access to their therapy. We didn't see the doctors, we didn't see the nurses, we didn't see the unions. No one was there to be seen, and there's still something that persists to this day, is I don't see the professional organizations. We see very brave individuals, including many of the people in this room, but we don't see the organized medical professionals standing up. We also don't see the people who are supposed to be protecting us, the Health Professions Council and others, standing up for those people. And I think that they're all fighting for the interests of the profession, not fighting for the interests of patients. And it's something that's deeply disappointing to me that persists. It's not only South Africa, it's an international thing. But it is something that we do need to start thinking about when it's only two organizations, the Clinician Society and the rural doctors people, who were in the thick of it then and often are the only people in the thick of it now. And we see it now. We see it even with the COVID times, that there were a whole of very brave people standing up, and we're seeing it again. It's almost the same people from the 2010s who are standing up and fighting around the vaccines and transparency issues and everything else that's going on. Within government, and I think those of us who see these feckless politicians and carrying on, there are really good people in government who are trying to work hard, who try and work within the system. I often feel terribly sorry for them because you know, the politicians talk a lot, do very little, provide no support, and these people are often the ones who are in the firing line where they're trying their very best. And many of you have worked with them over the years, trying to do these things. We've had our casualties. Jerry died this morning, you heard, and I think for many of us, having dealt with him over the many, many years, he called a spade, and he told government its fortune, and no one liked it. He told the Beki people that, you know, exactly what he thought of them. A dear colleague of ours, Salisha, worked within government, they worked within the NGO sector, and eventually worked with us, died at the end of 2021 of breast cancer. And then a close friend of mine, Jupp Lange, had the Russians shot down his jet in 2015 over the Ukraine. It's another cynical Russia attack. Great advocates for HIV. And during this time, we would continue to publish, we continued to churn out papers showing the efficacy of what we were up to. Everything changed, bizarrely enough, in 2008. I mean, it's quite, when you think of what the rest of the country went there to go through, HIV actually really, really benefited from Zuma taking power. It just took away all the barriers. There were other issues within the health system, but all the stuff we were grappling with, the fighting for every single step forward, disappeared almost overnight. And now we're seeing in 2023 with 6 million South Africans on therapy that is as good as anything you'll get in New York or in Adelaide or in Paris. In 2018, Essentia was formed. We left RHI and formed a much more focused unit looking at HIV therapeutics. So I'm going to pivot now into the obesity story and how I got here. The story is an interesting one and completely unexpected. I started lecturing on aging and inflammation in about 2007 when it became clear that people were starting to live a near normal life, have a near normal life expectancy once they went into HIV therapies. And particularly if once they made it through the first 6 months, their life expectancy comes very close to normal. And once they're after the first year, it pretty much is normal. As I said earlier, HIV treatment pre-2008 was pretty ugly. It was not just in South Africa, it was pretty ugly throughout the world. The drugs were very toxic. It was quite fragile. If you didn't take your tablets every day, religiously, twice a day, you could break them and you get resistance very quickly. There was lots of tablets in the morning, lots of tablets at night. And we spent a lot of time writing guidelines, trying to fix things, trying to work out what to do with resistance patients, how to deal with adherence, how to deal with toxicity. And then a changing thing happened in 2010 at the Vienna AIDS conference. Those of you who have never been to an AIDS conference, this does not happen at oncology conferences or at neurology conferences. I've never been to a geography conference, but I'm going out on a limb and I bet you it doesn't happen there. But AIDS conferences are a different breed, okay? And we were going to go meet Bill Gates. We were going to go read him his fortune about, you can get Microsoft packages and Coca-Cola into every place in Africa. Why can't you get drugs? We were having real problems getting ARVs into rural areas of Africa. Anyway, so after meeting him, this remarkable person from the Gates Foundation called Stephen Becker sat me down. I've never met this guy in my life. He became a really important person. Sat me down and said, let's talk about something called treatment optimization. How do you make treatment easier, safer, and cheaper? And he used a drug many of you will be familiar with called 3TC or lamivudine. It's in pretty much every single ARV combination in the world at the moment, 99% of them. Anyway, 3TC was a good example because there are two ways you can pretty much bring down the cost of a drug. You can either improve the manufacturing process, make it more efficient so that you don't lose as many of the chemicals, you use less machinery, less energy, whatever. Or you can decrease the dose, okay? And he was interested in talking to me about decreasing the dose of one of our antiretrovirals. 3TC at that stage cost about $30 a year to make, the manufacturing cost. But the company that was making it charged about $1,000. So that's about $970 profit, which is, by the way, kind of standard for most blockbuster drugs. So there's not really impetus from the company to go and make that $30 more efficient. You rather go and find more markets, do more advertising, whatever else. However, if you're a generic company that's selling it for $50, interrogating those efficiencies becomes much, much more either getting the dose down or making the manufacturing process better. And a lot of my work since then has been looking at those two factors. And this was really important because in 2008, we had this global financial meltdown. And it looked like the drugs and the cost of the ARV program was under severe threat. So we were going to design ways to actually bring down the cost of the ARV program. At the time, the drugs that we were using, a drug specifically called stavudine or D4T, had terrible side effects. There were side effects that worried the patients, and you can imagine which of these this one was. And in fact, it didn't make them grow boobs. It actually made them lose fat on their face and on their chest, and it was actually a really dreadful side effect. The side effect that would worry the clinicians was a side effect called lactic acidosis, which June Fabian described at the time in this single-site cohort here in Johannesburg, a terrible side effect associated with a very, very high mortality. And those of you who were involved with it, June's in the audience, this is her lovely wife, Sandy. It was a really, really scary side effect. And we thought if we brought down the cost of, if we could bring down the dose, maybe we could get less side effects. The problem is there was an alternative, but it was much, much more expensive at the time. Anyway, that's a very long and protracted and controversial story. I was going to spend more time on it. For various reasons, the alternative actually dropped in price fairly dramatically and it became a non-starter. But it did allow me to firstly publish it, but secondly to construct the core of a team that's all sitting in the room at the moment to prepare for the next large study. And it was amazing what we were able to do with that team and to learn how to do large-scale clinical trials, some of the largest ever done in Africa. The second study we did was one for a protease inhibitor, a study called 052, which we did at Charlotte Mcleke. And this was to start looking at what we were thinking about, a blue tablet and a red tablet, very matrix sort of strategy we did with an amazing person called Andy Hill, working at the University of Liverpool. And we presented this at the Amsterdam AIDS conference. And again, demonstrating that we could lower the dose of this particular antiretroviral, which is very, very expensive, successfully if we do it in a certain way. But the thing that made us famous and which really put us on the map and has changed all of our thinking was a study called Advance. And I'm not going to bore you with the details, but there's this new drug which has completely changed HIV, and it's a drug called dolutegravir. So what came along, and it was actually cheaper than the alternative, which is weird in medicine. Normally things come in medicine which are much, much more expensive. It also seemed to be less toxic. So to get something that's cheaper and better is very unusual. So what we got here was, what we had to do though was show it was better. So we went up against what everybody in Africa was on and what everybody maybe 3 or 4 years ago was in the US and in Europe. And then we did a study comparing 3 people. And we took people from the streets of Hillbrow who were newly diagnosed with HIV. And we gave them this drug. The study had USAID and Unitaid and South African MRC sponsoring it. And the drugs were given to us by the drug companies involved, and it was an amazing study. And we did it super, super fast. And with the eye of bringing down the cost of the program, I remember briefing Jürgen Pillay and saying, there's this new drug, and he was like, okay, whatever, Francois. And I said, we can save you 10 billion rand a year. And he said, tell me more. And then Sumisa Sokelo, who's the co-PI on the study, said to me at the time, she said, you know, our patients are gaining weight. I'll be on PC. She said, Francois, they're all getting fat. And honestly, she was the first person to call this. She said, there's something about this that's weird. Something is happening that's dramatic that we've never seen before. So I swanned off to Mexico and presented our data, and I'm sorry, these didn't. But we presented this data at Mexico, this huge conference, and I just remember the audience just started talking like out loud when they saw this data, because they'd never seen anything quite like this. This dramatic weight gain that we'd never seen in antiretroviral studies before. And like why was this happening? Like, those were the questions. These drugs which are new, which shouldn't, you know, a new drug is always, doctors especially, you know, new is always better. And this suddenly was not better. It was particularly severe amongst women. Anyway, after we'd finished dusting ourselves and enjoying Mexico and everything else, we jetted back home. And everybody said the drugs were causing the weight gain. And that's obvious. Like, you know, you switch from one regimen to another. And this was happening here in Joburg. Like, clinicians were on the old drugs, and they were switching across to the new drugs, and they're all starting to gain weight. So people, you know, it sounds realistic that they were making this. And we started publishing stuff saying, what are we going to do about this? Like, what happens when patients, should we go back to the old drugs? The old drugs were more toxic, but nobody wants to gain this kind of level of weight, 10, 15 kilograms. And as we've got more and more data, it seems like this plateau, they do start to plateau, but they do continue to gain weight. Luckily, UCT came to our rescue, and the amazing collaboration we have with Gary Martins and Pumla Sipgabi at the pharmacology department at UCT, they used our samples, and I'm not going to go into the arcane nature of this, and they did some incredibly elegant studies using the PK samples that we had actually generated from Advance. And they actually demonstrated that the old drugs were actually blunting weight gain, and that two of the drugs that we commonly use, tenofovir and efavirenz, actually were slowing weight gain. And take it from me, Gary had to explain this about 9 times, very patiently, and then steadily less patiently, and that was the second time was less patient, because Gary's not necessarily always the most patient. He is possibly one of the smartest human beings on the planet, and I thank goodness these guys did this study, because I think we'd still be wandering around saying these drugs caused weight gain. And they firmly have signed, sealed, and delivered this to us, and said that actually there's still some questions around one of the drugs, but I think for all intents and purposes, we now know that these drugs do not cause weight gain. The old drugs were actually blunting that weight gain. And what we realize now is inflammatory processes like HIV, once you shut off the inflammation, people are primed to gain weight. We see this in some of the other inflammatory conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, some of the inflammatory cancers, some other inflammatory conditions. And in fact, there's been physiologists saying we would have predicted this happening, which is not good news for people with HIV, is that once you shut it down, particularly people who have advanced HIV, that they might be prone, not everybody gets it, obviously, but that they might be prone in many cases, particularly if you're a black woman, to getting HIV and weight gain. So we rushed off and do what researchers do, which is publish more papers, and showed, though, that the benefits of dolutegravir were still very, very high. So you might ask yourself, why did you not notice this? What were you clinicians doing, sitting on your hands with these old drugs for the last 20 years? And one of the important things is that when we went back and looked at the registration studies, Andrew Hill, again, who we work very closely with, showed that actually all these registration studies were done on gay white men in actually quite middle-class affluent areas. They weren't even representative of America and Europe, let alone of like Southern Africa. And this is a real problem. It's not just with ARVs, it's actually with oncology drugs, with antihypertensives, you name it, is that drug companies with registration studies go to the lowest risk people they can possibly find, and that's where they test their drugs. And this is why we need to be much more careful about starting to insist that more studies get done. Shabir always makes this point in media interviews that Africans are under-researched, not over-researched. They're not guinea pigs. We actually like, you know, we kind of the people they come and sell the drugs to at the end and have to consume these things willy-nilly. Advance has been amazing. We've had, Sumisa tells me, over 30 papers now published out of it on everything from pain to cardiovascular risk, and still stuff is coming out. And at the moment, the HIV treatment package is on a very firmly with people like Simiso and Sissy Kecho from Uganda are busy looking at injectables. And I see Kalin's also, and she calls them Jorvaqueen. She's looking at these injectable antiretrovirals, which are the next future, which are drugs which can be administered 2, 6 monthly, maybe even annually. to people with HIV. So the HIV pipeline, treatment pipeline is amazing. It's going to take a few years to get there, but we've got this one tablet a day, which is incredibly safe and effective, but we're moving towards the injectables. Now to obesity, and this is why I say this feels like 2000, is the drugs are revolutionizing everything in a good way, and it's complicated, it's messy, it's all over the map. We know obesity is associated with a whole lot of bad things. Obesity by itself, actually, just having obesity, and I'll show you some data from KwaZulu-Natal, is probably not a bad thing. But obesity plus anything else, hypertension, diabetes, you name it, is probably not a great thing. It makes everything else worse, and we're still trying to dissect what that means. And losing some weight benefits that. So if you have hypertension and you have obesity, losing some weight will bring down your blood pressure. So there's lots of reasons for people to lose weight. And this obesity treatment pyramid, which I've never seen in my life before, but which seems to be like kind of the holy grail of the obesity world, which I've been dragged kicking and screaming into, starts at the bottom there with lifestyle modification, which is the usual eat less and move more. And it may horrify you to see there that's 2 to 5% weight loss, and that's temporary. If you get what's called prescriptive nutritional intervention, these are like the weight loss shakes and things, you can get up to 5 to 10%. Then you're into the drugs, and then you can get 10 to 25%. Then putting balloons into your stomach and stuff, you get to 10 to 20%. And then proper surgery and a whole range of these procedures, you start hitting the 20 to 40% zone. The problem with those other bottom two is that they're temporary. They're almost, in the vast majority of people, it comes back. 1 or 2% people can keep the weight loss down. They're the people who write textbooks. They're the ones who won't shut up at the dinner table. They go on to talk shows. They're actually genetically able to shed that weight and to keep it that way. The rest of us suffer in shame, and it's been shown again and again, the vast majority of diets eventually will fail. And most people who actually exercise will gain weight. But nobody talks about that, and I was taught that at medical school, that's the only way. And then this study that's just come out in JAMA actually demonstrates that only 5% of Americans were actually able to lose weight who wanted to lose weight. So it's really not feasible to simply suck it up, eat properly, and exercise. The vast majority of people are not able to actually get that right. So we have a whole range of new drugs, and old drugs actually available, and some of these are available in South Africa at the moment, and we certainly are able to use them and are using them. And a lot of these drugs, other than ghastly old drugs like Alestra, seem to operate at this corner of the brain that's involved with hunger. And I'll come back to that in a moment because it's really interesting, because it's not just hunger. And we're slowly learning about how they work. So they all seem to act on areas where you're craving food, and they just seem to shut down the need for food. There's probably more to it than that, because there's some things that are occurring at the basal metabolic rates, which are different. But we have a whole range, and anyone who's been living under a stone, who hasn't been living under a stone for the last year, has heard of Ozempic. Some of you might have been trying to get it, and good luck with that, because it's completely out of stock, not just in South Africa, not just in Joburg, but across the world. The alternative, liraglutide, is now out of stock across the world. The third GLP-1 that was available across the world is now sadly almost unavailable. And now we're starting to run out of orals by the looks of things. So, and the problem with many of these drugs is they're actually indicated for diabetes as well. So the people with diabetes who are on the drugs are suddenly not able to get them. The drug company that makes it, unfortunately, has created the market, has absolutely no plan, it seems, to be able to make it. And this is the problem with generic versus originator companies. Originator companies are not good at making things at scale. They're not good at making things in a hurry. And this company has, has priced this stuff. It costs 6,000 Rand for this particular drug, semaglutide. In South Africa, it costs 10 grand in America. And I'll show you some data in a moment. And then all the other drugs that are on this list as well is similarly, there's no plan to take this to scale, to get it to people. So there's an international shortage, and that international shortage is going to be here probably for years to come. But they work like a bomb. This is just one of the many, many studies that came out. And you can see that people are losing about 20% of their body weight, and it's maintained as long as they can get the drug, which is obviously, and this is with lifestyle interventions, okay? I'll come back to this second. And as I said, what's happening now is the drugs are so efficient, they're becoming similar to surgery. That's how good they are. So it's not a question of surgery is the most optimal thing. The drugs are actually as good, almost as good as surgery. And some of the newest drugs that came out in the last 2 to 3 months, some of the results are probably as good as surgery. In the future, it seems like there may well be a world where we use a combination of minimally invasive surgery and the drugs, which might take us there. The problem is once you stop, the weight comes back. Now, everyone's like, oh my God, that's terrible. I'm afraid that's what happens with hypertension. That's what happens with diabetes. I don't quite understand why people are so upset about that. Obesity is a progressive disease. Once you start gaining, you gain some more. And there's lots we don't know. We don't know how long you're going to take. Can you taper the drugs? Can you take a smaller dose? Can you stop them altogether? We don't know what the side effects are. The side effects look pretty good so far. There are side effects, but in the grand scheme of things, they're looking quite good. We don't know. Some of them are oral, some of them are injections. We're not sure which ones people will prefer. Do you prefer taking a tablet every day versus a self-administered weekly injection? We'll see. And they cost an absolute fortune. And way beyond anything the medical aids will pay in this country, way beyond what... and they don't have to. This was a study we did earlier this year, which looked at the cost of manufacturing the drug with a healthy profit for the drug company. Ozempic, semaglutide, is charged at 6,000 Rand. We worked out it costs about, at most, 600-700 Rand with a healthy profit on top of it. So again, 10% of what it could. So we could have this drug. It certainly might be more expensive than what perhaps the Department of Health is immediately able to and willing to pay, but it certainly can be brought down in price. And my experience with these kind of things is that once the generic companies have rolled up their sleeves, it'll come down a lot. And we've got a whole range of amazing people, including people here at WITS and at Harvard, who are starting to do that, rolling up their sleeves, starting to get the studies into women, into HIV-positive people, people with pre-diabetes, with established diabetes, pregnant women, people who are stopping breastfeeding, people who are gaining weight, maybe using it for a brief period even. It reminds me about a pre-exposure prophylaxis, stopping you getting HIV in the same way stopping you getting obesity, using the drugs in the same way. This is freaky. They're starting to use remember I said the drugs stop you craving. It's not just food. They're using it for opiate addiction, for alcoholism, for cigarettes, and now for gambling. So, for South Africans, we should just put in the water and be done. I think it's like fluoride and semaglutide, like combo. But it is really interesting, is like we're starting to understand stuff, and that doesn't mean that things like exercise and diet are not important. We actually understand more and more that these are incredibly important interventions for general health. But it does make it easier to do those things. And I must just tell you, as a practicing clinician, try and get people to stop smoking, stop drinking, stop all these things. Medicine's been unbelievably unsuccessful at this point at doing these things. So this provides at least the first idea of hope for what might be coming. So it's interesting to see how this pans out. This is not just drug company marketing. This is actually independent researchers noticing that somebody was losing weight, also had stopped drinking. And it's just interesting to see where this goes. I think also we need to acknowledge that there's a war going on. There's lots of people who have made a lot of money from all of us feeling pretty crappy about being overweight. And that's not just the diet industry, it's the exercise industry, it's the gym industry, it's the book industry, you name it. Whether it's the snake oil salespeople like Dr. Oz and all our own local oddballs, they're all out there. And I think that, and health workers have often colluded with this, I think. And you go to every second GP is selling some ghastly snake oil that makes you lose weight. These epidemics are new, and I think I talked about how the HIV came along when, for many of us, started in our lifetime. But what's interesting is it's new and it's going upwards. For instance, in South Africa, we had slow and steady weight gain in the white population, but it exploded in the late 1970s only, and certainly in the black population in the 80s. So again, it's not something it's really related to a change probably in the food supply coupled with a rise in affluence. And the South African epidemic, I think any clinician can tell you, you just went into your local clinic and you can see how, we just need to look at our politicians and can tell this. But you can look at how women disproportionately are affected by obesity and by the numbers. It's also starting to have an impact. TB and HIV used to be the biggest killer of women. Now it's type 2 diabetes, which is strongly correlated with obesity. TB is still the #1 killer of men, but diabetes is steadily coming up there. And Karen Hoffman, who's done lots and lots of useful work in terms of this stuff, has started to look at it's almost a 2/3% of our GDP now is consumed by overweight and obesity. Over 2,500 Rand per South African is now spent on this in terms of their estimates. Our understanding is evolving, and we now know that what we used to, you can go into the journals and there's like, I don't care if it's the Atkins diet or the Banting's diet or God knows the Mediterranean, there are 20, 35 different diets. And now we're sitting here with a situation where I think it's quite clear that what you need to do is to move towards, as much as possible, to away from processed food. And that seems to be, it's not just implicating obesity, it's implicating this wave of cancer that we're seeing in young people and a whole range of other things. All the diets are associated with weight loss, temporary weight loss, some slightly more than others. But what's clear to us is now that what we should be addressing within the food supply issues to try and get this away from this as much as possible. The problem is that fresh fruit and vegetables are steadily getting more and more expensive, and processed food is steadily getting cheaper and cheaper, and more delicious and easier to engineer to hit that base of your brain we were looking about. I think this is a really nice little thing to talk about whenever anyone tells you about behavior change. There's not a single country that's reversed its obesity epidemic in the last 30 years. With all the resources, everything going for it. So when people tell me, oh no, we must get back to basics, we must do the food, and they thump the table about it, like, show me a positive example. We're going to need to come up with new models and actually injuries. This freaked me out. I can see I got a lecture from my vet last year, which was one of the most shameful things that I've ever had to deal with, which is I almost changed vets because I was so I couldn't bear going back, but about my cat having gained 1.5 kilograms. But the fact is that the same thing's happening amongst pets, despite the fact that it's not about the fact that you're overfeeding them and they're not exercising, they're still fattening themselves up. And this worldwide pet obesity is happening at the same time. So there's something about the food supply that's actually changing. Also, what we're seeing is that black women are disproportionately affected. And obviously for South Africa, that's, again, something that we're going to have to take. The prevention stuff is very, very complicated for both diseases. I remember writing this article about logic and sex, because everyone in HIV has got a theory about why HIV is so bad in Southern Africa, because it's not Africa, it's not even Southern Africa, it's like really a small circle around the tip of Africa. Everyone's got the theory. It's promiscuity, it's sugar daddies, it's lack of condoms, you name it, it's gender violence. None of those explain quite why it's so there. And we had to write this article questioning some of the, what was, I think it was concurrency was the theory of the moment at that time. And Lucy just puts it really well, which is that a lot of medicine is about moralism. Like, if it tastes good or it feels good, you shouldn't be doing that because it's not good for you. If you're not sweating and suffering on the treadmill, it's not good for you. And I think there's a lot to that in the HIV field, but there's a lot of that when it comes to diet. And if you ask most lay people and healthcare workers, the reason people are fat is because they've got no self-control. And increasingly, when I go to these obesity things, because this is now what I do for my living, it's not about that. It's all about the food supply. It's about genetics. It's about all the social determinants that we talk about, and that people just can't actually help themselves because the stuff is so tailored to your taste buds, and that hits the base of the brain. There's not much you can do to actually counter it. And Kristen Dunkel, a really amazing researcher out in Cape Town, said this to me when she's 2 or 3 years ago. She said, if you took an aggregate of data that we know at the moment, you weren't told what your weight should be, what would you think it should be? And Jen did this study a couple of years ago in KwaZulu-Natal and actually followed people over time and demonstrated actually that if you were significantly overweight, you actually had a lower death rate. And watching epidemiologists argue about this paper is a bit like watching statisticians fight. You just kind of get out the way and you kind of tell me the answer when you're finished. But she did demonstrate actually that people who were bigger lived longer. So it's not as simple as fat's bad. And again, we're going to have to tease all of this stuff out and make sure it's relevant to South Africa. But the thing is that we as a medical community have been really, really cruel. And I've been cruel as a doctor, telling people they must exercise more and they must, and since I went through, got a little bit older and got COVID, I noticed it didn't matter how much I exercised and it didn't matter what I ate, I was gaining weight. And that now there's a lot of anger from a whole group of obesity activists towards the medical fraternity saying, you guys weren't evidence-based. You came up with all of stuff you sucked out of your thumb and directed at us. I think one of the things HIV taught me was how to work with the media. And I think, again, we're seeing this with obesity. It's as an information portal, stimulating debate. And we're seeing it now in South Africa. There's a whole range of people. I just put Thabo Best up there because I think Roundup has probably been one of the best soap operas of all time for all of us. But they've really been useful in terms of the HIV epidemic, I think, for COVID-19. And more recently, we're starting to see them delving into the food and obesity stuff, talking about why BMI isn't a good measurement, what are the pros and the cons and all the rest of it. And I think for many of us, having found having dealt with the media, the other thing is talking about genes and environment. And again, yeah, one of our joint appointments, Jen Cohen, used this term. I think she was talking about me. She denied it last night when I asked her permission to use the thing. It's capitalism stupid. And she pointed out in advance is that we're getting such vanishingly small benefits on improving ALVs. But the big chunk of people who are disappearing from the program, it's because they're unemployed, it's because they're poor, they can't get to the clinic. It's not about the side effects. Like almost no patients are disappearing from the programs. Our drugs are so good. Like continue to do drug development research seems to be like a bit pointless actually. And I'm reminded of the TB research that's coming out at the moment that shows simply paying people to be in the program and feeding them actually has far more benefit than improving than some of the results we're seeing from some of the anti-TB research. But medicine doesn't like doing that. We like paying attention to our drugs, and I think it's again a lesson to us that we need to do that. So Miso and some of us then have put together what we think is probably going to be required for getting universal ALV. The last 20% of people are not getting the ALVs, and I think that we've paid a lot of attention to the fact that these social determinants are probably in the end going to be far more important than the stuff I've done for the last 20 years, which is tinker with the drugs. So Professor Jeff Wing, who's a character of note and who is everybody's family endocrinologist, says the way to deal with obesity is choose your parents carefully. And Jeff here, exhibiting classic good food behaviors, has been teaching us how to use these drugs. He was in the thick of the ARV wars with me. He was the one seeing the patients at Charlotte and talks about how these drugs can be used. He's been using them for the last 20 years, mainly because he saw his diabetics getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and he just needed to do something. And he's been very generous with his time in teaching us, me specifically, and Nomatemba, many other people, on how to use them, and it's been really great. But you can see the kind of advertising here with Krispy Kreme, and looking at the queue that went outside the door when they first opened is clearly alarming. And I think there's a growing consensus that the way we're going to have to deal with this is with government intervention. The problem is our government is a denialist government, like many governments. It's not just ours, but and I think this quote, and I see Edwin is in the audience, that started with HIV. It's one of the most powerful quotes I ever read about HIV. At the height of the denialism, when, like, Thabo Mbeki's spokesperson died of AIDS, when he was the deputy president, his home is 500, maybe a kilometer away from Charlotte, where people were dying on the floor. And he said he'd never met anybody with HIV. And I think that this idea of, like, we can always question about apartheid and we can talk about the Nazis, but when stuff is happening right in front of your very eyes and you deny that it's happening, you need to, like, really have deep questions. And I think that in many ways what's happening with our food supply, where people are dying of undernourishment and overnourishment, I think the good news is that we're seeing this obesity epidemic, but we're also seeing breakdowns in the quality of the food supply. This listeria outbreak, which is the worst listeria outbreak the world has ever seen, killed so many people. Cecile's in the audience, and she was the last author on this publication, is going to be really important. We're seeing people stepping out again from the academic and from the civil society. And it's interesting watching, it's coming from TAC, and Treatment Action Campaign, and this group called HEALER, many of whom are old activists from the Treatment Action Campaign, starting to fight for food labels, starting to ask for government subsidies for fresh fruit and vegetables, asking for them to make the food supply healthier. And then academics like Priceless going out and managing to get sugar taxes out there, which have been demonstrated to help things along. Government's completely asleep. Like some of this legislation has been pending for years and years and years, and I think is going to need to start changing. Along with this, we work with these amazing behavioral people, and I think it's really amazing that we're going to have these drugs which are going to be able to do this. So winding down, and I can see you getting jumpy. So how are HIV and obesity similar? I guess the thing is both are very common. They're hugely important health issues, but they're complex. Stopping them is not going to be one size fits all. We're going to need a whole lot of strategies to actually combat them. We're making progress with HIV, significant progress. We're making no progress with obesity, and I think that is going to need to be touched. we're going to need government intervention. Many people don't like that. I don't like that because the government just at the moment doesn't seem to be able to mow the lawn, let alone be able to come up with something as useful as this. But we really are going to need them to get stuck in to do all of this. They're highly dependent on external social factors, and we need to understand those. It's not simply sheer willpower that's going to solve all of this. Black women are highly vulnerable to both diseases and continues to this day. The majority of new HIV infections continue in young black women, and we still haven't cracked that. Helen's unit is doing a whole of this work, and it's something that we still need to focus on. But the obesity stuff is going to, the ones who manage to stop getting HIV, many of them are going to get obese. There's a huge amount of stigma and blame that goes with this disease, and we're going to need to start challenging our own inherent stigmas. The new drugs are completely transformative. They're messy at the moment. We still don't know exactly how to use them. We don't know what's going to happen. We need to bring it on the price. But like I said, it reminds me of HIV in the early days. Delivery systems are going to be the Achilles heel. The delivery systems were the Achilles heel of the HIV program, and they're going to be the Achilles heel here. And we do not know how to do this. We are really shocking it. I see Richard Cook's in the audience getting, from family medicine. We're shocking at dealing with diabetes, at hypertension, at integrating care. I think Mark Hayward used to irritate the hell out of me. He used to go to the National Strategic Plan, and we'd say, how many people are we going to put on ARVs? And he'd say, 90% of people. I said, Mark, we've got like 4% on now. We can't get to 90%. He said, no, put 90% there. And lo and behold, we would finally get to 80%. I would never think we'd even get to 20%. And I think Mark did teach me the benefit of having more health ambition. And I think sometimes the people from the TB world and diabetes world need to listen to that and start thinking about what we managed to get accomplished with HIV. With enough ambition, enough money, enough research, we can probably get lots of stuff done. So what are we doing next in my unit? I've got a whole lot of very smart people. We've now found out that hypertension seems to be very, very common, not just obesity. Luckily, we've got a whole range of international superstars and local superstars who are going to be coming in and are going to be looking at why hypertension. And Samantha's got this amazing integrated hypertension program. But one of the projects we are really interested in, which is one of the toughest things I think to crack in primary care, is how do you integrate primary healthcare services in a way that makes sense and which is useful to patients. And I have yet to see a scaled, integrated primary healthcare service. People will tell you that evolved, that they have this at scale. I have yet to see a clinic that offers HIV services, hypertension services, contraception services, that actually has this all-in-one beautiful package at, say, a district level. And Kuli and her team are busy tackling this, and hopefully first in and around Hillbrow we'll be doing this and then taking this forward. The other area we're looking at, and this is going to blow your mind, is we've opened our own sleep clinic and sleep evaluation system. Alison Bentley and Nomatemba are leading the charge on this. Sleep, bizarrely enough, has been linked to everything from sleep apnea to cancer. So we've now tapped into two things I think that the world, like all of you probably have a vested interest in, is bad sleep and a weight gain. I certainly have as I've got older. And we are hoping to expand this dramatically in terms of both training outfits and beyond. So I think the 4 take-homes I had from my career over the while, I think it's really important to fight for these social justice issues. And I really hope that the health profession would just get up a little bit more in an organized fashion. Wouldn't be left to the brave individuals to stand up, sometimes get fired, get taken out by senior people, powerful people at times, and start taking these things a little bit more seriously. I think very important to work with people you like, and I've been very, very lucky to do that at the moment. I think do work that makes a difference. And I think that I've been very lucky to be in the HIV field, where work really has made a difference. And I'm hoping that this obesity and sleep stuff starts making a difference. And then finally, try to be kinder. I'm finding it very difficult on Twitter. Shabir is much better. Twitter taxes me in a way that I've never thought was possible. I only started using Twitter at the start of the pandemic, but I think that there is something to be said for trying to understand sometimes the Department of Health, even those ghastly politicians, and sometimes trying to give them, just try and understand where they're coming from and try to work out how we can start supporting them. And finally, I'd just like to thank all my friends and family and all the rest, my long-suffering climbing partner, Yaku, who's in the audience, and the people who work, and then finally the 2 little monsters that actually rule my life at the top there. Thank you very much.
thank you, Francois, for that wonderful talk. And this is the first inaugural lecture that I've been involved in where the audience actually risen and cheered. So obviously a really remarkable talk. And it really shared with us your journey from childhood through your failed attempts at becoming a tennis star, to the wonderful work that you've been involved in and the type of difference that you and your team have made in terms of the past, in terms of gaining access to antiretroviral treatment for people living with HIV, but also identifying the newer challenges. I noticed that the audience sort of had this gasp about semaglutide and the wonderful effect it's going to have. That's even better news. So the latest is that in preclinical studies, it's actually a drug which actually mimics the benefits of exercise. It increases your metabolism, it builds your muscle mass, and it gets you to drop weight. So in a few years' time, trying to do mountain climbing and playing tennis to lose weight or exercise, not needed. Watch TV and do it. So at this stage, it really also gives me a pleasure to extend a special welcome to Judge Edwin Cameron. For those, everyone knows Judge Edwin Cameron, but just in terms of his relationship to the University of Witwatersrand, despite his heavy workload, he agreed to become a member of council at WITS in 1997, and he was subsequently elected as the chair of the newly constituted council in 1998, a position that he actually held for 10 years in a completely voluntary capacity. Currently, it's really remarkable to have him in our presence because currently he's the Chancellor of Stellenbosch University. But what's also really remarkable of Judge Edwin Cameron is his passion to continue training. So he actually volunteers his time to the medical faculty to actually lecture our medical students on human rights and health, even to this day. And Judge Cameron, my apologies for having not included you in this year's lecture series and oversight on our part, but we really, truly appreciate your contribution to WITS and to the faculty. And obviously all that you've done also in relation to making a voice heard when it comes to the care of people living with HIV. Thank you. So now it gives me pleasure to call upon Prof. Lucille Bloomberg, also another name which is familiar to most of us, to give a vote of thanks on Prof. Venter's lecture. Prof. Bloomberg is currently a consultant in infectious diseases at Right to Care, South Africa, where she focused on creating a One Health program within the Right to Care and responding to health emergencies in South Africa and the region. She has specialist qualifications in clinical microbiology and infectious diseases, before which she was a pediatrician in the making and an intensivist in the making, and many, many other things. Until 30th of September 21, she was the Deputy Director at NICD and the founding head of the Division of Public Health Surveillance and Response. During her 20 years in the division, she has responded to many communicable disease outbreaks, including cholera, influenza, the pandemic 2009, rabies, Ebola, and many, many more, which I'm not going to list now. She currently holds an honorary position at the NICD supporting the division and also acts as a medical consultant to the Center for Emerging Zoonotic and Parasitic Diseases. She holds honorary positions in the Department of Medical Microbiology at the University of Stellenbosch and the Faculty of Veterinary Science at the University of Pretoria, in addition to which, most importantly, she is honorary doctorate at the University of Witwatersrand. So, Prof. Bloomberg.
So thanks very much, and really such a great pleasure to be here this evening. I can't work that. So yes, to really pay tribute to our man of the moment tonight. And I think your delivery of your inaugural lecture was about you, delivered with passion and energy, informed by science, and always practical. I'll try not to fall off. I'm not good at climbing mountains like our speaker. But I think what really stood out was you never spoke about I. You always spoke about we. When I asked you what were your most proud achievements, it was Izinsha and the we in the team and the collaborations in all the studies that you've done. I think what stands out for most of us is your ability to be brave, to stand out there, to go for the difficult issues, and to use the science to inform what you're going to do, and not just put out a paper, but look at practical ways of access and delivery. And your collaborators are all over. They're in the community, they're activists, they're scientists. There's no bounds to those collaborators. And then you, this unique person. How often have I phoned you and you said you're at the top of a mountain? I can't speak now. Unfortunately, you often fell down that mountain. Perhaps an area you need to spend a bit more time on. But Francois, we look forward to you climbing many more mountains. You are a bit of an opportunist. I think you've identified some really critical issues that have come out of HIV, that have come out of COVID. And so we look forward to this next chapter when I have no doubt